Some mysteries are so strange, so bizarre, they just defy any easy explanation. We're about to dive into a case that has absolutely baffled investigators and conspiracy theorists for decades. It's a story about 9 experienced hikers who went into the mountains and just never came out. And the only official explanation? That they were killed by an unknown compelling force.
And you gotta understand, these weren't amateurs. Not at all. They were smart, capable mountaineers, students from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. The expedition they were on was Category 3. That's the highest difficulty rating. They were literally prepared for anything the mountain could throw at them. Or so they thought. This journey would be their last.
And this is where the story gets really weird, right from the start. Soviet investigators, they wrapped up their case in just a few months, and this was their official conclusion. Not an avalanche, not an animal attack, an unknown, compelling natural force. I mean, what does that even mean? It's so vague, it almost feels like a cover-up. What did they find on that mountain that they just couldn't or wouldn't explain?
So when the group didn't show up on schedule, a massive search operation was launched. What they found on the slopes of Kholat Shakal, which by the way translates to Dead Mountain, wasn't just a simple case of hikers getting lost in the snow. No, it was a scene of pure, illogical horror.
Okay, so here's the first huge, baffling clue. Their tents, their only protection against the freezing Siberian winter was sliced open. But get this, not from the outside, like an attacker trying to get in. It was cut from the inside. Something terrified them so much that they thought their only option was to slash their way out into the deadly cold. And it gets stranger. The footprints leading away from the tent, they weren't frantic. It looked like the hikers had just walked calmly down the slope. But they didn't stick together. Their bodies were eventually found scattered all over the mountainside, separated from each other in the darkness. The scene at the camp was just the beginning. The state of the bodies themselves presented a whole new set of contradictions that have fueled wild speculation for decades. Every new piece of evidence just made this puzzle more and more terrifying.
So the first 5 bodies were found near a large cedar tree and on the path back toward the tent. But the way they were dressed, or undressed, made absolutely no sense for the negative 30-degree weather. Some had no shoes, others had on just a single sock. 2 of the men, who were found by the remains of a tiny fire, were stripped down to their underwear. It's completely illogical. Why would anyone take off their clothes in the middle of a fatal blizzard?
And the horror wasn't over. Not by a long shot. For 2 more months, the search went on as the snow slowly started to melt. And finally, buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine nearby, they found the last 4 hikers. And what they discovered about them would be even more shocking.
What they found in that ravine, that's what took this case from a tragic accident to a truly disturbing, and I mean disturbing, mystery. The injuries these last 4 hikers had were just catastrophic, and yet profoundly strange. The sheer force involved here was just staggering. 2 of the hikers, Lyudmila and Semyon, had chest fractures so severe, the doctors said they were like what you'd see in a high-speed car crash. Another had a fatal skull fracture. But here is the truly bizarre part. These massive internal injuries had almost no external wounds. No bruises, no cuts, nothing. It was as if they'd been crushed by some kind of invisible force. Even the medical examiner at the time, a Dr. Vozrozhetny, was totally stumped. He stated point blank that no human being could have inflicted these kinds of injuries. The force was just too great. And then you had those other bizarre soft tissue injuries, which, well, they only added fuel to some of the wildest theories. As if this case wasn't strange enough, there was one last detail. When they tested the hikers' clothing, several pieces came back with significant levels of radioactivity. Now, it wasn't enough to be fatal, but it was definitely enough to be unexplainable. Where in the world did it come from? So, with a puzzle this bizarre, a slashed tent, impossible injuries, radiation, you can just imagine the theories that started flying around. For decades, this case was a magnet for speculation, everything from secret weapons tests to, well, creatures from folklore. Was it a Soviet weapons test gone wrong? I mean, the radiation and the crush injuries, it makes you wonder. Or could it have been a rare natural phenomenon, like infrasound?
That's a low-frequency noise that can literally induce panic and make people go mad. Or was it something more terrifying? A Russian Yeti? An alien encounter? For 60 years, these questions had zero answers. For years, the case files were totally sealed, but recently, a couple of scientists decided to tackle this mystery, not with speculation, but with physics. And get this, they actually used animation code from the Disney movie Frozen to help them model how snow behaves. They wanted to see if science could finally explain what seemed completely inexplicable. They focused on the one theory that had been dismissed really early on, an avalanche. Now, the original investigators said the slope wasn't steep enough for one, but these new scientists, they had a very different idea. What if it wasn't a typical, huge avalanche? So their model proposed something called a slab avalanche. Here's how it would have worked. The hikers completely unknowingly set up their camp on a weak layer of snow. By cutting into the slope to pitch their tent, they basically created a fracture point. Then, hours later, as the wind piled up more snow on top, a small but very dense slab of snow broke free. It wasn't a massive, dramatic avalanche, but a compact block, maybe 5 meters wide, that just slammed down onto the tent while they were sleeping. And that would explain those car crash-like injuries without leaving big external wounds. And this is brilliant because it explains why the original investigators missed it. They thought the slope was too gentle, but the new terrain modeling showed there were hidden steep sections, plenty steep enough for exactly this kind of avalanche. The hikers had unknowingly camped in the perfect spot for a disaster. This avalanche theory also neatly explains the strange state of the bodies. After fleeing the tent, injured, in the dark, and totally disoriented, they would have succumbed to hyperthermia. And this triggers a known medical condition called paradoxical undressing. As the body starts to shut down, blood rushes to the surface of the skin, creating this sudden, intense feeling of being incredibly hot. In their final confused moments, victims will often tear off their own clothes because they actually believe they're burning up. So the slab avalanche theory is incredibly compelling. I mean, it's backed by physics, and it explains so many of the weird contradictions in this case. But does it explain everything? A few questions still kind of linger. The avalanche theory is now the leading explanation. It's even been accepted by Russian prosecutors who reopened the case. It provides this logical, scientific chain of events that explains the core mystery, why they fled the tent, and how they got those horrible injuries. So let's just break it down. The cut tent, that's panic after the impact. The internal injuries, that's the crushing force of the slab. But what about the other weird stuff? The lack of debris is because the avalanche was small and got covered by wind. The radiation, while it likely came from one of the hikers who had worked at a nuclear facility. And those gruesome soft tissue injuries? Medical examiners now believe it was simply the result of natural decomposition and scavenging animals in the ravine. The avalanche theory seems to tie it all together with this chilling logic. It was a perfect storm of bad luck, unfortunate timing, and just unforgiving nature. But for a mystery this deep, some people will always feel that something more sinister was at play. So what do you think? Is this case finally closed, or do you believe another force was at work on Dead Mountain? The science is compelling, for sure, but the story is just haunting. I want to know what you think. Drop your own theories in the comments below. Which piece of evidence do you find the most disturbing? Let's talk about it.